Good morning.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, Kimberly and Tim. I was going to say good morning and good afternoon and good evening to our friends around the world because Tim,
I'm in
you're
London, yeah.
you're in
Good
London.
afternoon, yeah.
Good
All right.
afternoon. But Kimberly is on my side of the world, so we're both early morning.
Yes.
Welcome, Kimberly, to our show. Kimberly, for the audience watching and who don't know her, she is a trauma recovery therapist in the Northwest of the US. Kimberly, tell us why therapy and give us a little bit of background there.
Ooh, that's such a big question. So, why therapy actually has so much to do with my own personal story. And I would love to have a chance to tell you guys a little bit more about that. But I think the simplest way I could say it is I had a life-changing experience in my own trauma recovery therapy. And it was something that just like I couldn't not do. Once I knew about how humans heal and how it made me feel and how it changed my life, there was something in me that just came alive and kind of pushed me through all of the many, many years of training that I've had in order to sit with other humans. So, and then I forgot the second part of the question already. That's how small
Well, here's the thing. You're not supposed to ask two questions in a row because Tell us, Kimberly, a little bit about your journey, your story that progressed you into therapy.
Yeah, so I actually started my own trauma recovery therapy when about 12 years ago. So I had gotten married very young, and I was in a very conservative religion at the time that was the thing, right? You found somebody, you partnered up, you got married. And there wasn't a lot of conscious thought around doing that. It was just, this is the next step. And I followed that really, really well. I did what I was supposed to do. Unfortunately, I wasn't very conscious at 18 because I had already suffered so many years of my own domestic violence in my own home. So I had a mother who was not fit for parenting. Thankfully, she was the best way I can describe her is a little bit of a black sheep from my family of origin, my extended family. And so I had this beautiful community behind her that I could kind of link in, but I lived this dual existence with my mom. So my mom was not a healthy person. She parented in a very tragic way. And people who grow up in that look for that in partners very unconsciously. And so I found a partner who did just that. I knew my role when I got married. This is kind of the tragic part of the story. I was actually hit when I was still dating this person, but in my story, that was very normal. I thought, this is just how people love me. That was literally what went through my mind. And so building from there, getting married, having babies really, really young, and doing the correct thing also meant that I actually physically started to die, got very depressed, very much numb, didn't really know who I was. And that was what threw me into my own therapy. And when I started therapy, I had no idea. Again, it wasn't a decision that I made thinking, something's wrong, I have to fix it. It was more just out of desperation. People are telling me, hey, you need to go work on yourself. Something's wrong with you, rather than something's happening to you. So, which I find is very common for trauma survivors to enter into therapy, kind of with that same voice of people are telling me something's wrong with me and not really saying, hey, your environment's pretty whack and that's why you're all jacked up. So went through the course of therapy, got connected with an abuse recovery ministry, which is a local to us ministry and outreach that works with both perpetrators and victims of domestic violence. And they do a lot of education. So kind of that baseline education around domestic violence. So the long story is, as I get involved in that, I was invited to come and actually tell my story to first responders, which included police officers, therapists, clergy members, and kind of tell them what it was like to be in a domestically violent relationship and what it looked like and felt like. In the course of that, I just found a speaking voice, and I was very surprised that I kept getting invited to come back and do these teaching things. And in the course of that, I thought, it would be amazing if I could maybe write, or maybe, and again, this is a very tender hope that I have. What if I could write? What if I could speak? And that was really where I thought, well, I guess an education might be really helpful. So at the age of 29, having been in therapy at that point for about 5 years, I signed up for a Bachelor of Science in Human Development. And again, it's so interesting to me to kind of look back and to realize how truly unconscious I was, how numb I was, didn't really have an idea about what the implications were of my choices, what my dreams were at that point. I just thought, I think I might be okay sort of at this speaking thing. And so what could I do to support that? And so I started my undergraduate degree at the age of 29 and started pursuing kind of what that next step would look like.
You become... I'm echo. Sorry. Ooh, how do I fix it?
I don't know. Shall I just ask a question? And
yes,
you can muck about with.
It's your turn, Sam.
You teased something earlier. You said there was something that you realized that made your trauma treatment better. I don't know if that was for other people or on yourself. So what was that realization? What was the thing that you realized could really help people recovering from trauma?
Well, I would say it's interesting, right? Because I think in terms of, and I'm going to answer your question, but let me back up a little bit, because in my idea of trauma recovery and in my idea of like becoming very consciousness, I often use the metaphor of like an onion. So if you think about an onion, it's got many, many layers to it. It's all an onion, but you're going to peel off different parts of it. And on the outside, you're going to peel off this very papery part. And then you're going to find the flesh and you're going to keep peeling. And I think to answer your question is that's come up and showed up many times throughout my story where I have this thing inside of me. What is it? And I think at the beginning of my story, that would be being invited in to teach about domestic violence as a victim. There was something that was responded to, and that felt very inviting in that part of my story. So that's probably the outside of that onion idea, is that people were responding. I was invited in to come do it more. Eventually, I was invited in to actually train perpetrators on the long-lasting impacts of domestic violence as well. And from that, kind of earned the right to develop a program to teach other survivors how to tell their stories. And so again, it's kind of this unfolding or this peeling back of there's something in me. I don't know how to name it. I don't know how to see it myself, but I'm seeing it reflected on the faces of others as I'm being included in this new to me world. And I would say there's many iterations of that will happen throughout my story up to this point.
So the trauma part and being invited into these places. Now, had you done specific trauma therapy to that point? At what point did you start the trauma therapy?
You know, this is what feels like such a divine intervention, if you will, or some people would say it's a coincidence. I think it's something much deeper spiritual about the way this happened. I had actually tried on 3 different therapists, and for different reasons, they hadn't worked out, they had moved, whatever it was. And I happened to land in a therapist's office who did trauma recovery, and I had no idea. I would say she never used that language with me. And for maybe even like the first 8 to 9 years, I wasn't even conscious enough to realize that's what I was going through with her in trauma recovery. I was placed for whatever reason in my story with a beautifully well-trained, perfect therapist for me. And I've been with the same therapist for 12 years.
I think it's such an interesting thing when therapists have a therapist.
Yeah.
And because every therapist have therapists. What is that like in your journey and your story as well?
Yeah. You know, I think that gives me incredible insight and understanding. So I wrote a tiny little Twitter post about this a couple months ago, and it sounded like, oof, that's my response to being on the couch. Oof, therapy hurts on the couch. Well, I can carry that into my chair and say, oof, therapy hurts. And it hurts me as a clinician too. But then there's this joining of kind of this really incredible dynamic thing that happens between myself and my clients, because I'm like, yeah, I sit on the other side of the room myself. I know what this feels like. And so for me, I think, gosh, it's such a benefit to play both roles and to understand the interaction between those two things. I can't imagine doing this work without my own therapist on board. I simply can't. I think it makes for a better, well-rounded experience for my own clients, for me to be continuously processing my own experience.
Absolutely.
So something we talked about before Christelle turned up in the pre-chat was, I mean, I'm 48, so I'm old. Well, I'm not really that old, but I mean, it wasn't anxiety, therapy and trauma especially weren't particularly things that people talked about when I was young.
Mm-hmm.
But now loads of people I talk to are either in therapy for trauma or have had traumatic events in the past.
Yeah.
So do we think that there's just more trauma around, or as possibly, I expect, not putting words in your mouth, there was a lot of trauma in the past and people just didn't talk about it, or they didn't deal with it with therapy?
In my opinion, I don't think that we had language to discuss it. And I think that our scientific knowledge of the brain and our understanding of sharing information and research has allowed us to create a common language. And that language now we use, and as we communicate with other people, they're finding resonance. And so I don't think that there's any more trauma at this point in our timeline as evolved humans than any other time. I just think we have a language for it. We've been given curiosity and permission to explore that curiosity. And so people are talking about it. And you can't deny the fact that the whole world just went through a pandemic, and that itself is traumatic. And so now everyone's like, wait a second, I understand anxiety in a way that I never have before. Wait a second, I think I might have been depressed when we were locked down. And it's like, yeah, you were. This is what's happening to us. Yeah.
Are you seeing in the midst of pandemic, because we still are in it, are you seeing in the midst of pandemic and in this season a new type of subject, a new type of theme emerging?
That's an interesting question. I would say no, but what I would say is it's a more consistent theme. So this is a curious part of my own experience. I graduated my master's program just in 2019, so I haven't been graduated for very long. And I opened my private practice in 2018 before I had graduated. So almost all I've ever known is being a pandemic therapist. So the change that I saw was my practice was slow to start at the beginning. Thankfully, I have a handful of master therapists with their hands on my back, really teaching me how to do private practice really well. But I would say, to give an example, in 2019 in January, granted I was off for a week or so, I think total I had something like 20 sessions. In 2021, I had like 96 sessions. So the way that my practice exploded because of the pandemic is just astronomical. So I would say, to answer your question, there's nothing new that I'm seeing. It's just people are now allowed to and given permission to. And quite honestly, the stop of the world meant that the distractions that people were using to get away from their anxiety, their traumas, their lack of boundaries, those things were no longer accessible. And so what we're seeing is, holy crap, bad things are happening. I'm seeing it now. I can't get away from it. I need help. And so again, nothing new, but the constancy of it is bringing so many more people into therapy. And isn't that interesting, right? We're a culture, at least in America, where we're so busy, we didn't even realize these things were happening. We just kept moving. And so now the forced slow is what's bringing all of this stuff up to the surface for people.
So what are some signs, this sounds like something from a YouTube video, but what are some signs that somebody has unresolved trauma?
Yeah.
I mean, if you're with meeting somebody or somebody reasonably close, how would you tell that they may have unresolved trauma and need to go to see a trauma therapist?
Such a good question. I hesitate because I don't want people to feel like they have to do this with other people all the time, right? Like, we don't want us to be meeting people on the street and be like, ooh, trauma, ugh. We don't want that. But I think there are some important flags to watch for, especially as we're building true relationship, right? The first thing that comes to mind is the idea of fawning. So the response to people please for someone else. So that would be, I would think, one sign. When I meet someone who is what I would call unconscious, right? Not super self-aware, very much acquiescing to what somebody else wants over and over and over again. That's where I go, oh, that kind of feels like people pleasing a little bit. And that would be a flag. Some other ways that I might see unresolved trauma when I meet somebody is massively over or under reactivity to what we would call an otherwise neutral stimuli. So the idea that, say, you're driving and someone cuts you off. If you get super ragey about that, might be something within you that's kind of unchecked, and we might need to readdress. Because the idea of unresolved trauma is that you don't have what's called affect regulation. So affect is just a fancy word for emotions. So an affect regulation means that there's a window of tolerance that I have around when people or things or situations upset me. Am I able to regulate myself into something that feels appropriate to what's happening? And so does that feel like that answered that question?
Oh, yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a couple questions for you. So I'm trying to decide what direction to go with this. I think I'll ask, what are your methods for trauma therapy? What type of trauma therapy do you use in practice?
Yeah. Despite my relatively newness to the field itself, I've done a lot of extensive training. And so I have studied story-informed trauma therapy under Byron Keller here, who's local. And I've also studied under Bonnie Badenoch, who does interpersonal neurobiology. I've done a lot of work around attachment work too. The beauty of my story is that I got all of these things built into me through my trauma recovery with my own therapist. And so after studying and learning and healing, I entered into graduate school kind of thinking, I think I know I want to practice. And I kind of want it to be this intersection between attachment work and interpersonal neurobiology. And after all my years of study, I've come out the other side and yep, that's the thing for me. So when we talk about like theory, I can list off this brain nerd stuff and I can sound really smart and I can talk about relational neuroscience, but the key really is how we are with people. So in my view, when I'm working with another human being around trauma recovery, I'm looking at, can I give them enough language to express what's happening within them? And then the second part is, can I love them radically? Can I accept them radically? And those are the points of how I work with trauma. Because what I'm really working with is like uncovering kind of this shroud that they're under in order to give them a sense of identity, not that I build in, but that they bring in and we explore with them. Mm-hmm. So in the end, it's truly how I am with humans, just sitting with another human being and saying, I love you, I see you, let's take off all of this outside covering of yuck and give you permission to just be human without shame.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier on, you were talking about when you were giving presentations to some of the perpetrators of domestic violence, whether male or female, probably male. But
mostly
do you have the feeling that with treatment they could be helped, or that they were doing this because of trauma or because of personality issues? What are your opinions on the perpetrators that you met of domestic violence, and did you think you made any difference to them?
You know, this one is a place that I still feel really fragile in myself. I don't work with perpetrators. So if I get the flavor of a perpetrator asking to come and see me, I'll refer them out because I don't work with that. I don't have the heart necessary to do that work. So I would say my answer is probably jaded, if I'm honest. You know, at the core of it, I would love to believe that men who harm, and I use men because that's my experience and primarily where I work, are reacting out of their own trauma histories. And I personally believe that personality disorders are most likely caused by pervasive trauma. So when I look through that lens, I think, yes, there's definitely recovery and hope for them as well. Also, I have a hard time. I haven't seen it. Statistically, it doesn't get a lot better in my limited view. That's what I would say. But I actually kind of hate that I have to say that because I don't know that that's fair or loving or kind. But it's my experience, and so that's how I talk about it.
It's an interesting topic to discuss when we're talking about women who have been abused and who have had that people pleasing and want to believe the best. And so you kind of have to run that line, I imagine, to know you can leave and now move into the perpetrator. There's hope for you to get better. I imagine that must be a really fine line.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think it is a very extremely fine line. And here's what I think makes it more difficult. As someone who has been a victim of domestic violence, pervasive domestic violence over a span of many decades, there is a little, maybe a little talked about fact, and that is reactive abuse. So we don't talk about this idea that our victims actually do abusive behaviors as well as part of their survival technique in that system. And so I do think like walking, it's like threading a needle, right? It is such a fine line, because the more I talk about perpetrators and hope or lack of hope, sometimes the victim will hear that and be like, oh, but I screamed, I threw something, I slammed a door. And so it's really, really hard to walk that really finely and with, I would say, an exceptional amount of grace too. So if I were speaking to perpetrators, what I would say is practice your boundaries and with staying, like, do not get yourself in a romantic relationship, because that's not healthy for either partner.
Well, I'm going to ask this question, even though you can go onto YouTube and find thousands of people who will say this, but what are some of the red flags that somebody's worried about, somebody who might be abusive in a romantic or other relationship should be frightened of?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's easily Googleable, right? But there are some things right away that come to mind. So if you feel like you are kind of, again, like acquiescing or bowing down to someone else's wants or desires, if you find yourself second guessing your own thoughts, your own capacity, your own ability to choose for yourself, that's a massive red flag. If you find that you're starting to isolate from your friends and family or lie to them or not tell them a full story about what's happening, red flag. The other thing that I tend to say is if you start making vows with yourself that sound like, I will never do this because this is how I'm going to be disciplined or punished, or I'll make sure I never say this thing again to that person. Those are some pretty good indicators that something's not right, right? So it's less about watching the other person, in my opinion, and more about watching yourself. Do you know yourself well? And can you start to see how you're reacting to this other human's way of being?
Okay, so when we get to the point of, it seems like we're talking about domestic violence here in trauma. So how does a woman who finally realizes she might be being abused, because often we don't, or they don't, how do we leave? What does that look like?
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but statistically, the most dangerous time in a victim's life is when they actually try to leave their perpetrator. And so the best way to do that, and this is complicated by most women, statistically speaking, again, will have to leave their abuser 7 times before it finally sticks. So that creates quite a confusion within the mind of the victim. Can I leave? Am I capable? Am I going to survive this? The other complication to that is when you've been victimized that long, you don't believe that you're capable of doing anything else, right? Usually you're financially dependent on that person. Your world is so shut down, you don't even recognize that you're like looking down. And so it's lifting your eyes and noticing that there's a world out there can feel really, really scary. And so how to actually leave depends on what your community looks like and how dangerous the situation is. I've worked not only with domestic abuse survivors, but I've also worked with teen mothers quite a bit too. And I would say there's consistency in, it feels too scary to get out of this relationship. Like, it's so bad I'm dying, but it feels too scary to get out. So that said, I would say, sometimes fleeing to a shelter and obeying the rules of that shelter are your best option, because the rules of that shelter are meant to break that go back to him, meant to break the fear cycle that you're caught in. That said, ultimately for what I would say are like middle class and upper class, you're going to want to figure out where that safe place that you can land is and prepare yourself, get what you need out of the house. I just think it's so hard to talk about that on a big scale because everyone's story is so different, but it's about making sure you have one person that you can count on and that you will trust their words of wisdom to be kind of what I would call your what's a good word for that?
Anchor.
Yeah, anchor. Yeah, and maybe even your decision maker for a period of time. So finding someone that you trust to speak truth to, that you can rely on them for helping you decide where to go, how to be for a time until you kind of root yourself back down.
I want to ask a question, Tim, before I know you probably have a lot too, but I want to ask a question for children in domestic abuse situations. A pattern I've noticed is children are in a violent situation or even an emotionally abusive situation, and they know they need to get out, but at the same time, they want to protect the parent.
Yeah.
Or they don't think they have anywhere to go and it feels unsafe. If I leave, the unsafe situation is going to only get worse.
That's so true. And I think you bring up the important underlying part of this whole thing. Our system is not set up to protect victims. They're not set up to protect women and children.
Yeah.
The rules that we have today regarding domestic violence only count if there's physical violence and only if you can see the result of the physical violence. So when we're talking about emotional manipulation or emotional harm, there's not a way out unless you have a community that can take you in and believes you. And even if you have that community, chances are they're going to question you. You're going to lose a lot of people in the process of leaving. So when we talk about kids, my heart breaks. That is my entire practice is filled with adults who have experienced childhood traumas. So we talk about two different kinds of trauma. We talk about the big T trauma that's very evident. You can see it. We talk about veterans who have seen war, accidents, sudden death, untimely death. We talk about complex trauma. We're talking about the chronic, persistent, underlying emotional traumas that happen throughout a child's lifetime. So I see literally every single person that I see has got this complex trauma in their background. That said, I don't work with kids because my heart breaks, because I watch them and I think there's nothing I can do to get you out of this because it's so hard to prove. So what I do when I work with kids is I work with teens. Sorry, I just contradicted myself. I work with some teens. What I will do is give them the best experience of therapy that they can have at that moment and validate what they're seeing and helping them to build their identity so that when they get out and they're an adult, they'll think therapy is safe and come back to me. So that's my goal when I'm working with kids. Now, that doesn't really answer your full question. What do we do with them? Here's what we do. As adults who know that this is true, we pick a child and we love that child unconditionally and we bring them as much safety and security as we can. Because the one thing that changes trauma in a child's life is having one person that they can rely on. That's the thing that changes how deeply the trauma embeds in their system. Did they have one person outside of their system that was safe for them to go to time and time and time again, that gave them a different experience in their home life?
Be that one person for one child. And I would imagine, Kimberly, it would be safe to say that probably, because we're talking about domestic abuse, to be wise, and I don't want to overstep my where I can speak into, so help me with this. I would think it'd be wise for women to be with women and men to be with men. And help me with this.
In terms of what? What do you mean?
In terms of, it feels like often domestic violence is male on female, that kind of thing. Would it be wise to make sure men are more mentors for male children, females for female children? Should we be wise to that in any way, or does it not matter?
I think it depends on who you talk to, honestly. I think that we can develop, and that's where I'm like, oh, it's kind of touchy. We want to make sure that we preserve the child's safety. And so if you're not an aunt or an uncle and you have that underlying safety, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to do any one-on-ones with the opposite sex with a minor child ever. We don't do that, right? So in that case, yeah, I can see that there might be a point to say, like, yeah, men absolutely help with male children. But that said, that's not
always. As I said it, as I was saying it, I was like, actually, I was hearing myself say, ask the question. Yeah.
In my own story, I have a lot of beautiful, lovely women. And also I have had experience with males that have helped me know I'm lovable in a very platonic way that have been so unlike how I've learned I'm lovable with the women in my life, if that makes sense. There's just a difference in being loved by the opposite sex very gently and intentionally in my story. But I think honestly, it's humans, right? Human connection, making sure that that's genuine and safe. That's the big thing, is being safe and consistent in the lives of those who have been harmed.
I'm going to ask one last question before Christelle asks her final question. And that is, or you were talking about this with the children, that you can only take them so far because you can't, there's nothing you can really do from a legal perspective. But how much do you think that just knowledge of trauma, personality disorders, and the rest of it is actually helpful for somebody going through this?
Oh, it's incredibly helpful. We talk about it in terms of planting seeds in my mind, right? I'm planting seeds that these children can then take into their adulthood and watch blossom. So again, it's about having that one safe person in their lives with whom they can connect and return to. Because in trauma work, in my view of how I do trauma work, a lot of it's reparenting the small child that's in. And so if they have a person that they can go back in their memory as they're sifting through what was my life like, and they can go back and insert that adult who was kind and helpful and safe to them, that will help them reparent that small part of themselves as they bring that into their kind of conscious awareness as adults.
I have so many questions I could ask, but our time is coming to an end. So Kimberly, this is what I'm going to ask. Where can our viewers find you? Online?
So I do have a couple of websites. I actually need to have them revamped. So KimberlyDudleyCounseling.com is an option. I have a blog. I would love to do more with it. I just haven't. Redemptive Grace blog at WordPress.com is the other place that they can find me. I am on Twitter. Twitter is kind of a little bit of a safe haven. I do a little bit of therapy stuff, but mostly just personality stuff there at Kimberly Inwardly.
Yes, I was reading James came up with a comment, and he says, agree, emotional well-being and emotional intelligence being shown and taught in schools is a good thing, and definitely agree on the healing the small inner child. Thank you, Kimberly, Tim, and Christelle. Thank you, Kimberly, for coming on. I could ask you a million questions, but I'm going to ask the viewers to go find you and ask you more questions. And if they need therapy and happen to be in the Northwest, contact you. And if not you, you can always refer out. So again, thank you so much for being here. These are hard questions and sometimes even hard to know what to ask because trauma is involved and stories are so complex.
You absolutely nailed that. Thank you so much for having me on. I would love to get together with you a little bit more because it's hard for me to not be asking the questions. I want to know about you too.
Tim will bring her on to ask us some questions.
That's right.
Well, I've had like other co-hosts in the past, and we have done interviews. Actually, I interviewed Christelle, and that was quite interesting. And we also interviewed Christelle's therapist years and years ago.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe you could come on and interview Christelle's therapist with Christelle.
There you go. Be a whole session.
Anyway, thank you so much for being the guest this week. And you can hang around and chat to us after the show, or you can go off and do exciting things in Portland.
Tim, I'm going to hold on really quick. Don't cut it off. Kim, can you tell us your blog one more time?
Redemptive Grace blog at WordPress.com.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's the link I've put in the QR code. So if anybody, I'm always getting this mirror thing down there in the QR code. You can scan it with your phone, and that is the website it'll take you to, well, it's my website, but it's got that link in it. So anyway,
Perfect.
I'll put your other website in as well. So
Thank
thanks
you,
so much for
viewers.
being a guest. Anyway,
Thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Tim. See you soon.
bye.
Bye.
This is terrifying for me.
I've made more money in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 7.
It's cliche shit, you know.